talk about the Trinity.
Yeah.
And so likewise, in this case, so going back to the question of language and specifically the issue of St. Augustine, I saw this recently. I replied to Dr. Gavin Ortland on some of his stuff about Mary, and he argues that Augustine seems inconsistent and, contradictory in terms of the veneration of the saints. And it only is inconsistent and contradictory through a Protestant hermeneutic. And this is something that is worth considering. That if Protestants are right, then you have to imagine that there's two different camps of early church fathers on the Eucharist, because some of the early church fathers are so abundantly clear on the Eucharist being Jesus that there's no way to deny it. You have to say, yeah, I just don't agree with what this guy is saying.
Yeah.
And then others, as you said, there's a little more wiggle room. Like maybe you can interpret them in a Protestant way, maybe you can interpret them in a Catholic way. The problem with them interpreting them in a Protestant way is twofold. Number one, you have to imagine that there's two different theological camps, but that these theological camps never argue against each other on this most important doctrine. We never find them writing, contra Augustinianum. There's nothing where like Jerome and Augustine are going at it on how one of them's a heretic on the Eucharist. We just don't find that. And in fact, Augustine is brought into Christianity by St. Ambrose of Milan, who has some of the clearest stuff on Eucharistic theology you're going to find in the early church. And so we would have to believe that Augustine contradicts Ambrose, and both of them are just cool with it. And they don't feel the need to address this fact or kind of sort this out. And what's more, you have to view Augustine as being against Augustine, because there are other places, when he, for instance, when he talks about Christ holding himself in his own hands at the Last Supper, where it's like, okay, well, this is pretty clearly a very realist view of the Eucharist. And so you find this even among Protestant historians of the early church, that if they're going to be consistent in believing that there was something like a Protestant view of the Eucharist out there, they have to imagine this kind of schizophrenia within the church fathers, or a kind of quasi-schism within the early church that nobody in the early church had noticed somehow. So for instance, I'm thinking of J.N.D. Kelly, who's fantastic Protestant historian. I think he's Anglican. I'm not 100% sure. I think he's Anglican, historian of the early church. And he admits that in this period, most of the fathers are unquestionably realists. And he's uncomfortable with that, but he's going to posit that there's some who might be just symbolic. And the problem with that, again, is what I've said, that you have to interpret this with such a lack of continuity between church fathers, or even within this same person's oeuvre, their opus of writing. You have to view them as self-contradictory. The Catholic view says, no, the Eucharist is an efficacious sign, like all the sacraments. So the Eucharist is real, but it also has a sign value. Yeah. But symbol isn't contradictory to reality. In a wedding, when the couple says, I do, that's symbolic, but it's also real. It really is doing something. You are now wed. God could have made some sort of, a wedding ceremony or designed the form of marriage such that the couple says, I don't promise this. And that was how weddings happened. But then the sign, the external thing, would contradict the internal thing. So the sign, the I do, that's a symbolic level, creates a real thing, a wedding, a union, a marriage. And so, this notion is something that we, in other words, all that's a very long-winded way of saying there's no such thing as symbol versus reality in the early church. A very last example, because Augustine is great on this. When he's talking about the wedding feast of Cana, he's talking about the stone jars. And if memory serves, there's 6 stone jars in John 2. And he argues that this represents the 6 days of creation and stands for the old order that is going to be renewed and redeemed. That the water becoming wine shows marriage and the whole Jewish system being transformed and enriched by Christ. Now, he doesn't think that the 6 stone jars didn't exist. He thinks they're real. He thinks they're also symbols. And so trying to pick and choose one of those two categories misunderstands the way a lot of the early church fathers think.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I guess the third option, Joe, is a huge conspiracy, right? Good friend of the show, Rod Bennett, writes about this, right? The idea that, okay, if so, maybe there were debates between Augustine and Jerome about the nature of the Eucharist, and there's all these Baptists throughout history, right, who are seeing this as symbolic, and the church just managed to whitewash all of that and remove all those documents. Well, sure, I mean, Rob would say, yeah, you can believe that. That's a massive conspiracy and kind of seems crazy, but you can believe it if you'd like to, right? There's just no evidence for that kind of third way of this mysteriously erased church history, right?
Yeah, it's so, I like I said, I'm working on this stuff answering Baptist secessionism, which argues that conspiracy. And the stuff that comes out actually contradicts it. So, for instance, there was the idea that the Cathars were really Baptists. They were misnamed, and their opponents were lying about what they believed. But if you actually were to hear them preach and speak and write, you'd find out that they just believed basically the same things Baptists believe today. And then in the 20th century, we discovered numerous Cathar texts that had been mostly lost, like the Two Principles. And a 13th century, it's an anonymous text. It's called like the Manichaean text. And in it, they talk about how there's two gods, a good God and an evil God. And it's like everything their opponents said, they are actually preaching that. And it turns out their opponents are fairly accurate in describing their views. And of course they are, right? Like if these are the people saying, hey, don't believe the Cathars when they tell you XYZ, they have to actually address the XYZ the Cathars are saying. So even if all of the Cathar or whatever group, fill in the blank, texts are gone, if they're all destroyed or if people just stop reading them and just get rid of them, you would still have the response text. So until the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library, the best source on Gnosticism was St. Irenaeus' Against Heresies. He spends so long cataloging what Gnostics believe in order to refute it. And so you can actually piece together, again, it may be inaccurate, it may be skewed in some way, it may be an uncharitable kind of reading, but you're going to get the gist by reading the opponents. And so I think that's just kind of worth bearing in mind, that if these people had existed, you would find church definitions on how you have to believe this about the Eucharist. You'd find responses to the Baptist heretics in the 4th century. We don't find any of that stuff. And the reason we don't find any of that stuff is there was no heresy to answer there.
Yeah. I get so even more, I think, damning, go a level deeper, is the centrality of the Eucharist to the New Covenant, like the idea of the old New Covenant, right? I mean, okay, so you can say it's symbolic. You can hold that view. It's not really tenable with church history, as you've shown us. It's difficult to do and really be historic, right? This is a very new innovation to see this as merely symbolic, as far as we can tell, apart from a global conspiracy keeping it hidden from us, Joe. But then you look at the centrality of the Eucharist to the covenants and what's happening in the New Covenant and how the Eucharist is so foundational to that understanding. It's really hard. I mean, okay, I'm a convert, and it's even hard for me, 6, 7, 8 years removed from that, to understand how to remind myself how I understood the New Covenant without understanding the Eucharistic, component to that. Because it seems like, gosh, I had Lawrence Feingold on the show a few weeks back. We're talking about this idea of the New and Old Covenant, and you can't have a New Covenant that's worse than the Old Covenant, right? You can't have an old covenant, a religion that had a tabernacle and the presence of God, right, dwelling there. You can't do away with that to have just this symbolic kind of presence of, okay, Christ is accessible everywhere to us now through the Holy Spirit, but not right there, which that seems like we're worse off now if we don't have that anymore as Christians. So
yeah, that's critical. And now I studied under Lawrence Feingold, so I'm sure he's influenced my thinking on this. But Hebrews talks about how the former things are a shadow of the things to come.
Yeah,
this notion of foreshadowing isn't just good screenwriting. This notion of foreshadowing is good theology. And so if the best part is what came before, in the Old Testament, think about 1 Corinthians 10, St. Paul's explanation of the sacramental economy of the church. He explains that in the Old Testament, you have something like baptism, where you have the Israelites passing through the Red Sea, the parting of the Red Sea, and they're led by the pillar of Spirit. So you have water in the Spirit. And so Paul says explicitly they were baptized in this moment. Now, he doesn't mean that literally. He's explaining this as a prefigurement of baptism. And then in the desert, they're given supernatural food and drink. He says this as well in 1 Corinthians 10, because they have the manna from heaven and the water from the rock. And Paul even says, and the rock was Christ. And so you have this really dramatic kind of scene where the people on the Exodus are being directly fed by God. And you say, if this is foreshadowing of some even better reality, what in the world is that? And it doesn't seem there's a lot of places to go beyond. Now we don't just receive food and drink from God, we actually receive God directly in receiving the Eucharist. That's the only step I can imagine above what the Israelites already had in the desert. And if you reject that and say this is just a symbol, then you have to say the old covenant is better than the new covenant. That God's presence was richer before the coming of Christ than it is now. And that defies the whole logic of the incarnation. It defies everything we understand about the mission of Christ and everything Hebrews talks about the foreshadowing. So that's one way of understanding it. Another way, also kind of building on the theology in Hebrews, is it talks about how even the first covenant was not enacted without the shedding of blood. And so here it's important to know two things. First, the story of the creation of the new covenant is the critical story of the New Testament.
Yeah.
And as proof of this, I would go to the fact that we call it the New Testament, and testament means covenant. So, you know, I've been giving the example. It's like if you name a book Lord of the Rings, that tells me the ring is pretty important. If you name a book The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I've got a sense of who to watch out for.
Can I say Lord of the Rings? I began that book, as a teenager. I had no idea what the ring. What's the? Got to read the whole thing to understand that.
So there you go. Yes.
Sorry.
So no, but that's right on point. And a lot of people read the Bible in the same way, where they're missing all this stuff about the creation of the covenant. But the fact that the earliest Christians call it the New Testament,
yes,
tell us that they understood this as the central theme. And now, given that, so you don't understand Christianity rightly if you don't understand the covenant. Given that, you might imagine Jesus went around every day preaching about the new covenant, but he doesn't. The only time he explicitly addresses the new covenant, one time, is at the Last Supper when he holds up the chalice and declares it the new covenant in his blood. Now, we moderns don't get that because we don't know anything about covenants. But for the creation of a covenant, it typically required actual blood.
Yeah.
And Hebrews talks about this as well, when it talks about how even the first covenant wasn't created without blood. It gives the example of Moses sprinkling the people with blood and saying this is the blood of the covenant. Now, the parallels between that and the Last Supper are so obvious that it's hard to miss. And then you say, okay, well, Moses really had blood and really did create the covenant. Are we to believe that at the Last Supper, Jesus wasn't creating the new covenant? He was just saying, this is a reminder of the new covenant I'm going to create, or maybe created else. Like, there's no clear kind of theology of the covenant formation that's faithful to ancient Jewish visions of the creation of a covenant. And for that matter, even ancient pagan visions of the covenant. So all that's to say is, just as you can't understand Christianity rightly without understanding the covenant, you also can't understand the covenant rightly without understanding what's going on at the Last Supper. And how do we know that? Because the only time Jesus explicitly addresses the covenant is right there. That you need to make sense of what is he doing here and what does that have to do with the covenant?
Yeah. I think that's amazing. And